Now let's move on to explore the anatomy of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus is located at the base of the brain. It's shaped like a flattened funnel and forms the floor and walls of the third ventricle of the brain. It's right below the thalamus. It regulates the primitive functions of the body, from water balance to thermoregulation to sex drive, as well as childbirth. Many of the functions of the hypothalamus are relayed to the pituitary gland, so the functions of the hypothalamus and pituitary are highly integrated. The pituitary gland, or hypophysis, is suspended from the hypothalamus by a stalk that's called the infundibulum. You may recall looking at this when we looked at brain structures. The pituitary sits right in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. You'll recall the Turkish saddle. It's high in the front and high in the back, and it guards this pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is composed of two structures that have independent origins and thus separate functions. The anterior pituitary, or adenohypophysis, is the portion that's most anterior. And the neurohypophysis, or posterior pituitary, is the portion that's located more posteriorly. It's the neurohypophysis because it's highly innervated. Indeed, it is a downgrowth of nervous tissue from the brain, whereas the anterior pituitary is a growth upwards from the pharynx. You can see this illustrated here in this picture. The neurohypophysis is clearly derived from brain tissue, whereas the adenohypophysis is a pouch that breaks off from the pharynx and forms the anterior pituitary gland. You can see that they're distinctly different in their histology. You need not study the histology in too much detail. Just recognize that one is of neural origin and one is not. Now let's take a closer look. The adenohypophysis again constitutes the anterior 3/4 of the pituitary. It has two segments, the anterior lobe and the pars tuberalis. The pars tuberalis is a small mass of cells that adheres to the pituitary stalk. We probably won't discuss it any further in this chapter. The anterior lobe is also known as the pars distalis. It's linked to the hypothalamus by the hypophyseal portal system. This is one of 3 portal systems that we see in the human body. A portal system is where we see one capillary bed linked by capillaries to another capillary bed. In this system, the primary capillaries are in the hypothalamus, and they're connected to secondary capillaries here in the adenohypophysis. They're connected to each other by portal venules. Hypothalamic hormones regulate the cells that are here in the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary. That is, neurons in the hypothalamus secrete their hormones into this capillary bed. These hormones are carried through the portal venules and are released into the tissue of the anterior pituitary. Here, they will have their effect on target cells. There are many hypothalamic releasing and inhibiting hormones that travel in the hypophyseal portal system from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. We'll explore many of them coming up shortly. In response to these release and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary will then release its own hormones out into general circulation. Take a moment here to diagram the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Somehow find a way to show the capillary bed in the hypothalamus and the capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. For now, you can leave any diagramming of the posterior pituitary out. I prefer to simplify this all and make a box. I might call the hypothalamus a box, and I might make a box for the anterior pituitary and a box for the posterior pituitary. For now, I would draw a capillary bed, maybe represented by a circle, connected by a line that represents venules, to another circle that we see down here in the anterior pituitary. But that's just how I would go about it. You make your choice. Next, we'll look at the posterior pituitary. You can add this to your diagram in a moment. The neurohypophysis, or posterior pituitary, constitutes the posterior quarter of the pituitary gland. It's composed of the median eminence, the infundibulum, and this pars novosa, or posterior lobe. Just as with the anterior pituitary, you really only need to consider the pars distalis. Here, you only really need to consider the posterior lobe, or the pars nervosa. Just remember that the median eminence and infundibulum are also part of this gland. Now, this is made up of nerve tissue, so it's not really a true gland. The nerve cell bodies are located in the hypothalamus and pass down through the stalk as the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, because they're nerves, and they end in the posterior lobe. In the posterior lobe, these hypothalamic neurons secrete their hormones, and they're stored here until they're released into the bloodstream. So take a moment to compare and contrast the adenohypophysis, or anterior pituitary, and its relationship to the hypothalamus, and the posterior pituitary and its relationship to the hypothalamus. Add this to your diagram. Now you have neurons that project directly down into the posterior pituitary, as opposed to having neurons of the hypothalamus that are dropping secretions into a capillary bed that will then be transported down into another capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. So in essence, the posterior pituitary is much more simple. Make sure you have this relationship clear in your mind and clear on your paper as you diagram it. It's going to be integral to your understanding of the rest of the content of this chapter, as well as much of the content that you'll run into next semester. Now let's step back and look at the hypothalamus again. The hypothalamus has 8 hormones that it produces. 6 of them regulate the anterior pituitary, and 2 are released into the capillaries in the posterior pituitary. Remember, the 6 regulating the anterior pituitary will be dropped in the hypophyseal portal system, whereas the 2 of the posterior pituitary are released directly into the posterior pituitary circulation. These are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The 6 releasing and inhibiting hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus stimulate or inhibit the anterior pituitary. They are TRH, or thyrotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, or gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and GHRH, growth hormone-releasing hormone. They're called releasing hormones because they cause the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. They affect the anterior pituitary secretion of TSH, prolactin, ACTH, FSH and LH, as well as growth hormone. So each of them are specific to a particular anterior pituitary secretion. So let's look at TRH as an example. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone is released into the capillary bed of the hypothalamus, and it moves down through the hypophyseal portal system into the anterior pituitary, where it stimulates the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone. The thyroid-stimulating hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary then goes out into general circulation and will eventually reach its target, the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is one of the very few places that has receptors for thyroid-stimulating hormone. In response to thyroid-stimulating hormone, The thyroid gland will release its thyroid hormones. We'll look at those shortly. There are two other hormones. They are prolactin inhibiting hormone, or PIH, as well as somatostatin. Both of these are inhibiting hormones. So they inhibit secretion of growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone by the anterior pituitary. So PIH and somatostatin are the only release inhibiting hormones. So there are only two hormones left to consider in the pituitary gland. Those of the posterior pituitary, or the pars nervosa. They are oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Remember, both are stored and released by the posterior pituitary after they travel down the neurons directly from the hypothalamus. They travel from the paraventricular nuclei and the supraoptic nuclei. You don't really need to commit those to memory, but they are the only two nuclei of the hypothalamus that we'll be addressing, so why not? Keep in mind, the posterior pituitary does not synthesize anything. It's releasing hormones that were synthesized by the hypothalamus and have projections that go all the way down into the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, in contrast, synthesizes all of these different hormones. Now let's move on to take a closer look at the anterior pituitary hormones. There are 6 principal hormones that go along with the 6 principal releasing and inhibiting hormones. There are 2 gonadotropin hormones that we'll begin with. These hormones target the gonads, the ovaries, and testes. The first one is FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and the second is LH, luteinizing hormone. Now, both of these are named for their function in the female. However, they are found in exactly the same form in the male. They were just noticed in the female first and named there. FSH is going to stimulate secretion of ovarian sex hormones and development of the ovarian follicles, as well as stimulating sperm production in the male. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation itself, as well as stimulating the corpus luteum in the ovaries to secrete progesterone after ovulation. Luteinizing hormone in the male stimulates the testes to secrete testosterone. So these are 2 hormones that you can now add to your diagram. You have a clear diagram of the hypothalamus and its relationship to the pituitary. Now add in some gonads, testes, and ovaries, and show how GnRH causes the release of LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary, and that LH and FSH go on to affect the testes and ovaries. Here you might add a little explanation of what LH causes in the testes and what LH causes in the ovaries, and the same for FSH. Next, we'll look at thyroid stimulating hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus travels through the portal system and causes cells in the anterior pituitary to produce thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone then stimulates the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormones. You can add that to your diagram too. Next, let's look at ACTH. So corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus moves through the portal system and stimulates the cells of the anterior pituitary to release a substance called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. This travels all the way to the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys and causes them to secrete glucocorticoids like cortisol and corticosterone. So you can add that to your diagram. We'll see that prolactin is also secreted from the hypothalamus. After birth, prolactin is going to stimulate the mammary glands to synthesize milk. It enhances the secretion of testosterone by the testes. So its secretion is primarily influenced by the hormones at the end of pregnancy. So we don't have a releasing hormone for it per se. Finally, let's look at growth hormone. Growth hormone is a hormone that stimulates mitosis and cellular differentiation of any tissues that require growth. So GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, that's secreted by cells in the hypothalamus into the portal system, move down into the anterior pituitary where they stimulate specific cells to produce growth hormone itself. Growth hormone has a variety of diverse effects that we'll explore in more detail later. Remember though, there's also somatostatin. Somatostatin is released by the hypothalamus and also has an impact on the release of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary. GHRH causes the release of growth hormone, whereas somatostatin suppresses the release of growth hormone. So you can add those two secretions to the hypothalamus and show their impact on the pituitary secretion of growth hormone. So now you should be getting a pretty good diagram going. We have the basic frameworks. Now all you'll need to add is a little bit of detail on what each of these hormones do. We'll come back to some of them shortly. Before we do that, let's look at these posterior pituitary hormones in more detail. Remember, there are only two, but they are not produced by the posterior pituitary itself. They're produced by the hypothalamus, and they're secreted out of the ends of neurons when they reach the posterior pituitary. It's the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract that leads to the posterior lobe. Antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that is released into the blood from the posterior pituitary and increases water retention and thus reduces urine volume and prevents dehydration. It can also be called vasopressin because it can cause vasoconstriction in particularly high doses. That means it would cause all the vessels in our body to constrict. The other hormone is oxytocin. Oxytocin is a pretty popular hormone these days. It's said to be the love hormone because it's a surge of this hormone that's released during sexual arousal and orgasm, and it's said to create attachment between mates. It also stimulates the uterine contractions that are seen in orgasm as well as the propulsion of semen. It promotes feeling of sexual satisfaction and emotional bonding between partners. It's also involved in stimulating the contractions we see during labor and childbirth, as well as milk flow during lactation. So it's involved in pretty much any experience where there's contraction. So in addition to promoting feelings of emotional bonding between partners, it creates emotional bonding between a lactating mother and an infant as the infant suckles on the nipple. Oxytocin is released and creates this sense of satisfaction. Don't forget to add these two hormones to your diagram and give a little explanation of their functions. So the rates of secretion of our pituitary hormones are not constant. They're regulated by the hypothalamus along with other brain centers, as well as feedback from the target organs themselves. You'll recall the anterior lobe hormones are under control of releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. For example, in cold weather, the pituitary is stimulated by the hypothalamus to release thyroid stimulating hormone. This acts on the thyroid along with some other tissues and leads to generation of body heat. When the body becomes warm, this inhibits the stimulation of the pituitary by the hypothalamus and thus decreases TSH. The posterior lobe is controlled entirely by neuroendocrine reflexes. As you'll remember, it's basically nervous tissue, and neurons extend from the hypothalamus down into the posterior pituitary. The hormones are released in response to nervous system signals. In the case of oxytocin, a suckling infant stimulates nerve endings, which end in the hypothalamus, and then nerves in the hypothalamus extend into the posterior lobe and secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin circulating through the body causes milk ejection from the mother's nipples. The hormone releases are in response to higher brain centers. For example, the milk ejection reflex can be triggered by a baby's cry, so we hear the sound. It's processed in the cerebral cortex, and that relays the information through the hypothalamus to cause milk ejection. Emotional stress also affects secretion of many hormones, including particularly the gonadotropins. This disrupts our ovulatory cycles as well as menstruation and causes some severe deficits in fertility. Here's an example of the feedback control we might see on the pituitary from some of the target organs. TRH has stimulated the anterior pituitary to produce TSH. The TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. The thyroid hormone goes off and has its effect on a variety of target organs. However, it also goes to feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to let it know that yes, indeed, there's plenty of thyroid hormone. If there's not enough thyroid hormone produced, then we'll continue the cascade of TRH stimulating TSH to produce thyroid hormone until we get adequate levels. This is a negative feedback system that we're familiar with already. In positive feedback, we can see that the hormone produced causes further and increased stimulation of the hypothalamus and the pituitary to produce more of that hormone. We only see this in the case of oxytocin, where stretching of the uterus during labor causes oxytocin release. This increase in oxytocin release goes to the hypothalamus and stimulates release of more oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, and that causes more stretching of the uterus during contractions, and thus more and more. So it's a positive feedback effect. It ends at the time of delivery when the stretching on the uterus ceases. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at growth hormone. Growth hormone has widespread effects on the body tissues, especially the cartilage, bone, muscle, and fat. It induces the liver to produce anything that stimulates growth, like insulin-like growth factors, or IGF-1s, or somatomedins, called IGF-2. These stimulate the target cells in diverse tissues. IGF-1 prolongs the action of growth hormone because its half-life is quite short. Its half-life is only about 6 to 20 minutes. In the presence of IGF-1, its half-life can be extended to 20 hours. This allows protein synthesis to increase. It boosts the transcription of DNA production, of mRNA, and amino acid uptake into cells, and thus the building of proteins. It also increases lipid metabolism. Fat is catabolized by the adipocytes. Thus, we have a protein-sparing effect, so all of the proteins can be used in efforts of growth. It also is involved in carbohydrate metabolism by mobilizing fatty acids for energy. Thus, growth hormone produces a glucose-sparing effect and makes glucose available for glycogen synthesis and storage or growth. Growth hormone is also involved in electrolyte balance. It promotes sodium, potassium, and chloride retention by the kidneys and enhances calcium absorption by the intestines so that bones can grow. So in the presence of growth hormone, we'll see bone growth, thickening, and remodeling, especially during childhood and adolescence. We'll see secretions of growth hormone are high during this phase. Secretions of growth hormone are also high during the first 2 hours of sleep. because it's during this time that we're going to fix many of our damaged tissues. It'll also peak in response to vigorous exercise. For the same reason, there's plenty of damaged tissue that needs to be fixed. As we age, growth hormone levels will gradually decline. We have an average of 6 nanograms per milliliter during adolescence and as little as 1 nanogram per milliliter in old age. The lack of protein synthesis contributes to the aging of tissues and the wrinkling of skin. So some people have found growth hormone to be an elixir. However, it has some pretty extreme side effects in the growth of cartilage. At age 30, the average adult body is about 10% bone, 30% muscle, and 20% fat. As growth hormone declines, these ratios change because we're changing all of these mechanisms that were described above. By 75, we see the average adult's body is 8% bone, 15% muscle, and 40% fat. Take a moment here, while it's fresh in your mind, and while you have the notes available, to outline all of the different functions that growth hormone can have. Do as much as you can without looking at your notes, and then go back into your notes, go back into the lecture, fill in the details. Do it again and again until you have a complete picture.